25 years ago today, OJ Simpson took off on the cart. Simpson decided not to surrender himself to police.
Live television is supposed to show us the truth as it happens. But sometimes the camera captures a mask so perfect, the true horror only reveals itself years later, making these moments far more disturbing than the day the world first watched them. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 10 live TV moments that become infinitely more disturbing because of what we know now. Number 10. On a freezing Tuesday morning in 1986, NASA was about to launch a dream. Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher in space, was strapped into her seat on the Challenger, ready to turn the stars into a classroom for millions of students watching live from their schools. But at exactly 73 seconds, the world stopped. A jagged plume of white smoke tore through the atmosphere. The shuttle vanished into a fireball. And a voice from Mission Control uttered the coldest understatement in history. Obviously, a major malfunction. For decades, we clung to a single, merciful lie that the explosion was so violent the crew died instantly and never felt a thing. What we know now turns that malfunction into a slow-motion horror story. The shuttle did not explode. The external fuel tank ruptured, and the orbiter broke apart from the aerodynamic forces. But the crew cabin remained completely intact. It separated from the disintegrating shuttle and continued upward on its own trajectory before beginning its descent toward the ocean. And inside that cabin, in the seconds after the breakup, at least 3 of the 7 crew members manually activated their emergency personal egress air packs, a procedure that requires conscious, deliberate action. Okay, you cannot do it if you are dead or unconscious. They were alive after the breakup. For how long? And what those final 2 minutes and 45 seconds felt like inside that cabin falling toward the ocean from 65,000 feet is something NASA's own report was careful never to fully address. But here is the detail that transforms this from a tragedy into something that should have never been allowed to happen. The night before the launch, in a teleconference that lasted hours, engineers from the company that manufactured the O-rings sent a formal written recommendation to NASA not to launch. The temperature at the launch pad was below the minimum safety threshold for the O-rings. NASA management told them to prove it was unsafe to launch, rather than the other way around. The engineers were overruled. The launch proceeded. Beyond those 7 people climbed into that shuttle the following morning, and none of them knew that the previous night, the people responsible for their safety had argued about whether to tell them the truth, and decided the schedule mattered more. The commission investigating the disaster found that NASA had been aware of the O-ring problem for 9 years, and somewhere in the recovered wreckage of that crew cabin, among the personal effects returned to the families, was evidence of those final minutes that NASA classified and has never fully released to the public. The smoke trail is still the image most people carry, 2 directions across a blue Florida sky. But the real story was always in that teleconference the night before, in a room full of engineers who knew, who said so in writing, and were told it wasn't enough. Number 9. For 3 hours on the night of June 25, 2007, WWE broadcast one of the most emotional tributes in professional wrestling history to a man who had already been dead for 2 days in a house where 2 other bodies were also waiting to be found. But what we know now makes every frame of that tribute feel radioactive. The forensic reality is that while those legends were pouring their hearts out on live TV, the bodies of Nancy and 7-year-old Daniel Benoit had been sitting in their Georgia home for over 48 hours, murdered by Chris himself. Forensic brain analysis later revealed the terrifying why behind the monster. Dr. Bennett Omalu discovered that Benoit's brain was so ravaged by years of unprotected chair shots and diving headbutts that it resembled the brain of an 84-year-old Alzheimer's patient. That he was suffering from advanced chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, a condition that effectively turned his heroic toughness into a biological time bomb of dementia and rage. The most disturbing details, however, were found in the digital breadcrumbs Benoit left behind while the murders were still in progress. Co-workers like Chavo Guerrero received a series of cryptic, chilling text messages during the weekend. One message simply read, "The dogs are in the enclosed pool area. Garage side door is open." At the time, colleagues thought it was just a weird note about food poisoning. What we know now is that it was a killer's final checklist, sent after he had already ended his family's life. Number 8. 95 million people watched a white Ford Bronco crawl down a Los Angeles freeway, convinced they were witnessing the final. Suicidal moments of an American icon. But what they did not understand was the calculated escape plan stashed in the back seat. It's June 17, 1994. OJ Simpson, NFL legend, actor, one of the most recognizable faces in America, has just been named the primary suspect in the murders of his ex-wife Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ron Goldman. A surrender has been agreed, a time has been set, and then OJ doesn't show up. Instead, his friend A.L. Cowlings calls 911 from a moving vehicle and tells the dispatcher that OJ is in the back seat with a gun to his own head. What happens next is really worse. NBC breaks away from the NBA Finals. Every major network cuts to helicopter footage of a white Bronco moving at 35 miles per hour down Interstate 405, surrounded by a police escort that doesn't quite know what to do. Fans at the NBA game are watching it on handheld televisions in the stands. Pizza delivery orders across the country drop by 30%. Entire highways pull over just to watch. For 4 hours, 95 million people sit in front of their screens watching a car drive, and somehow cannot look away. The Bronco eventually pulls into Simpson's Bel Air estate. He surrenders. It is framed as a broken man on the edge, choosing at the last moment to face justice rather than take his own life. Then, investigators open the Bronco. Inside, they find $8,750 in cash, a loaded .357 Magnum, passport, change of clothes, and a disguise kit, fake mustache, fake beard, the kind of kit a person assembles when they intend to become someone else entirely in another country. None of it was admitted as evidence in the criminal trial. The jury acquitted him after 9 months. In 1997, a civil jury found him liable for both deaths unanimously. In 2007, he published a book titled If I Did It, written entirely in the first person, in which he described, hypothetically, exactly how he would have committed the murders if he had committed them. The word IF on the cover was printed so small you needed to look for it. Number 7. The news helicopters were circling Columbine High School for hours, broadcasting what the world thought was the deadliest school shooting in American history. But what the cameras were actually filming was a massive failed terrorist bombing. It was April 20th, 1999, a Tuesday morning that fundamentally changed the way we watch breaking news. We saw students hanging out of library windows, and injured teenagers crawling across the grass, and SWAT teams standing in a silent, agonizing perimeter. The anchors narrated a story we all came to believe: 2 bullied, trench-coated loners who finally snapped and went on a targeted shooting spree against the jocks. It was the ultimate reality show with a tragic, unknown outcome. But what we know now is that the shooting wasn't the plan, it was the failure. Forensic evidence and journals discovered later revealed that Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold's actual plan had nothing to do with the shooting. They had spent over a year building 2 propane tank bombs, each one large enough to level the cafeteria building, and place them inside the school timed to detonate during the busiest part of the lunch period. The projected casualty count wasn't 13. Investigators estimated the bombs, had they worked, could have killed between 400 and 500 students. Harris and Klebold planned to shoot survivors as they fled the building. They wanted Columbine to be remembered the way Hiroshima is remembered. The bombs failed. Faulty wiring, a timing mechanism that didn't trigger. Everything that played out on live television, every gunshot, terrified student, and agonizing hour of the standoff, was the backup plan of 2 people whose primary attack had already silently failed in a school cafeteria while students ate lunch around them. And while the cameras stayed outside following containment protocol, a teacher named Dave Sanders lay bleeding in a classroom for 3 hours, with a sign in the window reading "One bleeding to death." SWAT teams were in the building. They were told to hold their position. Sanders died waiting for help that was already inside the building. A year before the attack, a family whose son had been threatened by Harris filed a formal report with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, complete with printouts of his website detailing plans to kill classmates. A deputy drafted a search warrant for Harris's home. It was never executed. The live coverage itself became its own catastrophe. Post-Columbine research established something that every news organization knew and mostly ignored: that wall-to-wall coverage, repeated names, the narrative of notoriety, directly inspired copycat attacks. The media blueprint written on April 20th, 1999 has been followed in school shootings ever since. The cameras didn't just cover Columbine, they helped write the instruction manual for everything that came after it. Number 6. 6 minutes into a sunny afternoon football match, the BBC's live cameras captured the deadliest stadium disaster in British history. But the real horror wasn't just the crush of bodies. It was the 27-year government lie that turned the victims into the villains. On April 15, 1989, millions tuned into Grandstand to watch Liverpool face Nottingham Forest in an FA Cup semi-final. Then, 6 minutes into the match, something started happening behind one of the goals that the cameras couldn't quite explain. Fans were spilling onto the pitch. Players were being pulled back. The referee stopped the game, and what looked initially like a pitch invasion, the kind of disorder that British football had become grimly accustomed to in that era, slowly, horribly, revealed itself to be something else entirely. People were being crushed to death in the standing pens behind the goal. What the cameras captured in those early, confused minutes was chaos without context. Supporters climbing fences to escape the pressure from behind. Bodies being carried across the pitch on advertising hoardings used as makeshift stretchers. Fans pressing their faces against metal barriers with nowhere left to go. 97 Liverpool supporters died that day, making it the deadliest stadium disaster in British history. And within hours, before the families had even been notified, a narrative was already being constructed and distributed to the press. The fans were drunk. Ticketless supporters had forced their way in. The Liverpool supporters themselves had caused the crush through their own reckless behavior. That story ran on the front page of the Sun newspaper under the headline, "The Truth." It would take that paper 23 years to apologize for printing it. Here is what a 27-year investigation actually found. South Yorkshire Police altered 164 witness statements after the disaster, specifically removing or softening any content that was critical of their own officers. 1. The police commander who ordered a stadium gate opened, the decision that sent thousands of additional fans into an already dangerously packed pen, held no UEFA safety certification for that role. Ambulances were held outside the ground on police orders while people were dying inside. At least 41 of the 97 victims were still alive after the initial crush and may have survived with a faster medical response. Number 5. Mission Control fell into a deafening silence while live cameras captured streaks of fire tearing across the Texas sky. But the most disturbing part of the Space Shuttle Columbia breakup was the fact that NASA management had already decided it was better for the crew to die unexpectedly than to know they were doomed. On February 1st, 2003, millions were watching the scheduled return of the STS-107 mission, waiting for the familiar sight of the shuttle gliding back to Earth. Instead, viewers in Texas and Louisiana tracked cameras picked up debris separating from the shuttle. Residents across 2 states heard their windows rattle from sonic booms they couldn't explain. And in Mission Control, a voice said the words nobody ever wants to say. "Columbia, Houston, we see your tire pressure messages, and we did not copy your last." Silence. Columbia never responded, because Columbia no longer existed. All 7 crew members were gone, and the entire world had just watched it happen live. Stunned, confused, assuming this was sudden, assuming this was unforeseeable. It wasn't. 16 days earlier, the day after launch, NASA engineers had already found the problem. A chunk of foam insulation had broken off during liftoff and struck the shuttle's left wing, Senior structural engineer Rodney Rocha was alarmed enough to write memo after memo flagging the damage as potentially catastrophic. He formally requested that military spy satellites photograph the damaged wing while the crew was still alive in orbit. Still a chance. NASA management denied the request, and then, in an internal communication uncovered later, a NASA director suggested to a colleague that it was probably better not to know, that the crew would rather have a happy, successful flight and die unexpectedly than spend their final days in orbit aware of the danger. Those 7 astronauts spent their last 16 days laughing, working, running experiments, talking to their families.
Can you hear me?
Completely unaware that people on the ground had already seen the damage, already read the memos, already made the calculation, and chosen silence. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board's final verdict was not kind. NASA had made the exact same institutional failures as the Challenger disaster. That was 17 years earlier. Not one thing had changed. Number 4. 20 laps before Dale Earnhardt died. He got on his radio and told his team owner that somebody was going to get killed that day. He was right. He just didn't know it would be him. To understand the full weight of what happened on February 18, 2001, you need one number, just this, 4. Because Dale Earnhardt was the 4th NASCAR driver in 8 months to die from the exact same injury. Adam Petty, Kenny Irwin Jr., Tony Roper, all dead, all from basilar skull fractures, all within the same calendar year. The sport had a pattern so obvious it had a body count attached to it, and it still wasn't enough to force a change. The Daytona 500 is the biggest race in NASCAR. 50,000 fans in the grandstands, millions more watching at home. And on that final lap, the 7-time champion, the most famous driver in the sport's history, and the man they called the Intimidator, made contact with Sterling Marlin's car and hit the outside wall at turn 4. His 2 teammates crossed the finish line first and second while their car owner was still in the wall. The broadcast cut to the celebration. Confetti, champagne. Michael Waltrip winning for the first time. Dale Earnhardt Jr. finishing second. Pure joy in victory lane. While 20 feet away, Kenny Schrader had climbed out of his own car, walked to Earnhardt's window, looked inside, and immediately started waving desperately for help. 20 minutes after the checkered flag, NASCAR Vice President Mike Helton walked to a podium in front of the cameras.
This is undoubtedly one of the toughest announcements that I've ever personally had to make. We've lost Dale Earnhardt.
Now here's what makes this story unbearable. A device existed that in all probability would have saved his life. The HANDS device, a head and neck restraint specifically engineered to prevent the exact injury that had already killed 3 drivers that same year. It had been developed, tested, and was being actively offered to drivers in the Daytona garage that very week. The inventor was there personally, fitting other drivers just a few stalls down from Earnhardt's car. Earnhardt was the only driver who didn't show up to the safety presentation. 3 days before the race, he'd sat with Dale Jarrett over beers and asked questions about the device. Was it comfortable? Did it restrict his vision? Then walked away unconvinced. His logic was simple and devastating in retrospect. He'd survived everything the sport had thrown at him for 20 years without it. Why change now? 20 laps before the end of that race, during a red flag stoppage, he keyed his radio, told Richard Childress that somebody was going to get killed out there that day. Then, the green flag dropped. NASCAR mandated the HANDS device for all drivers 8 months after the funeral. The sport has not lost a single driver in its top series in the 25 years since. Number 3. On August 23, 2010, Philippine Television Network went live to cover a hostage crisis unfolding in Manila, and without realizing it, handed the gunman inside the bus a weapon more dangerous than his rifle. A former police officer named Rolando Mendoza had boarded a tourist bus carrying 25 Hong Kong visitors in Rizal Park that morning. But he'd been dismissed from the force over corruption charges he swore were fabricated, and he wanted the world to know it. Cameras surrounded the bus within minutes. Helicopters circled overhead, the entire country locked in. For 11 hours, it looked like it was moving toward a resolution. Negotiators were talking to him. He was releasing hostages, children first, then elderly passengers. Reporters on the ground were cautiously optimistic. Then Mendoza raised his rifle, and by the time the shooting stopped, 8 of those 25 tourists were dead. Now here's what the cameras never told you while they were rolling. Mendoza was watching the live broadcast the entire time. Every move the negotiators made outside, he saw it on screen before they finished making it. The coverage that was supposed to document the crisis was simultaneously feeding it in real time directly to the man holding the gun, and the exact moment everything collapsed was a television moment. Live cameras outside the bus captured police grabbing Mendoza's brother, forcing him to the ground, arresting him on national television. Mendoza watched it happen through the screen inside the bus. He picked up his rifle 30 seconds later. Investigators concluded that watching that arrest live on broadcast was the direct trigger for the massacre. The media hadn't just covered the story. The media had become part of the mechanism that ended 8 lives. Some of the hostages killed in the final exchange were later found to have been struck by police gunfire. Not Mendoza's. The Philippine government issued a formal apology to Hong Kong 8 years later. Number 2. A superhero entrance was meant to be the comic relief of the night. Emperor Arena watched in paralyzed silence as one of them watched a man die while the show kept going around him as if nothing happened. It was May 23, 1999, at the WWE Over the Edge pay-per-view. Owen Hart was performing as the Blue Blazer, a goofy-caped superhero character, and the entrance gag was simple. He descends from the rafters, pretends to get tangled in his harness, crowd laughs, he makes it to the ring. Comedy spot. Done in 30 seconds. High above the ring, clipped into his rigging, Owen adjusts his position while waiting for his cue. The harness releases. 78 feet. He hits the top rope. He hits the ring post and lands in the ring. Referee Jimmy Corderas reaches him in seconds. The crowd goes the kind of silent that 16,000 people almost never go. That specific, horrible silence that falls when everyone in a room understands simultaneously that something has gone irreversibly wrong. A curtain gets pulled around the ring, medical staff flood in, and at home, pay-per-view subscribers are watching a pre-taped comedy segment on their screens, completely unaware that a man is dying 30 feet from the camera. Jim Ross comes back on air. His voice is already breaking. Owen Hart has fallen from the ceiling. Owen Hart is dead. And then the show continued. 3 more hours, 3 more matches, while Owen Hart's body was still inside that building. But the most heartbreaking revelation involves Owen's final act of selflessness. Some witnesses in that arena that night reported hearing Owen shout a warning on the way down. Whether that's true or not, it is exactly the kind of thing Owen Hart would have done, and that detail alone tells you everything about who he was. Now here's the part that doesn't leave you. The harness that killed Owen Hart was a maritime snap shackle, a piece of equipment built for boats, designed specifically to release under 6 pounds of pressure, so a sailor can free it one-handed in an emergency at sea. It had never been rated for this application. Owen accidentally leaned against the release mechanism while being lowered into position, and 6 pounds of pressure was all it took. And somewhere in the WWE vault right now, there is a tape. Cameras inside that arena captured the fall live. It sits in storage with documented written instructions physically attached to the case, never to be destroyed, viewed, and duplicated. WWE settled the lawsuit for $18 million. The snap shackle cost less than $50. Number 1. For 40 years, the face of British family television was actually a mask for the most prolific predatory abuser in human history. To generations of viewers, Jimmy Savile was Uncle Jimmy, the eccentric, cigar-chomping magician who hosted Jim'll Fix It, a show where he literally made children's dreams come true on camera. We watched him in his gaudy tracksuits and oversized gold jewelry, running marathons for charity, and being knighted by the Queen. He was a national treasure. He's so untouchable that he was even a personal advisor to the royal family and Margaret Thatcher. When he died in 2011, he was given a state-level funeral, with the BBC broadcasting tributes to his magic legacy. The horrifying truth discovered after that funeral transforms every frame of his 40-year career into a document of pure evil, because journalists investigating that documentary had begun hearing things. Then the things became testimony. Then the testimony became an avalanche that would ultimately reshape the entire conversation about institutional power, willful blindness, and what happens when fame becomes a shield that nobody dares touch. The official inquiry identified more than 500 victims. The youngest was only 5 years old. The abuse spanned 54 years, beginning as early as 1955, continuing through every decade of his public career, ending only when his body did. The most disturbing part of the footage isn't just what we saw, it's where he was allowed to go when the cameras were off. Savile used his celebrity to gain unfettered, 24-hour access to hospitals like Stoke Mandeville and high-security psychiatric facilities like Broadmoor. In hindsight, the details of his volunteering are bone-chilling. Forensic reports from the NHS discovered that at Stoke Mandeville, Savile would search the wards for young patients to abuse, leading terrified staff to instruct children to feign sleep when they heard his jewelry jingling down the hallway. He was even given his own set of keys to patients' rooms. And here is the detail that makes this a live television story, and not just a crime story. Police had received complaints about Jimmy Savile dating back to 1958, 53 years before he died. Multiple BBC staff members were later found to have been aware of rumors, warnings, or direct complaints during his active career. An ITV documentary investigating his behavior was killed in 2011. The same week, the BBC aired tribute programming in his honor following his death. He presented children's television for 4 decades. He was never questioned, never charged, never sat across from a single interviewer who asked the question that needed asking. He died knighted, celebrated, and completely untouched. The most dangerous place to hide, it turns out, is somewhere everyone is already looking. Which of these masks slipping left you the most chilled? Let me know in the comments below. For more deep dives into history's hidden horrors, subscribe and ring the notification bell now.